Excuse me, sir. Do you have a pass for this section? That was the sentence that started it all. He stood there in silence, a tall, proud black man in a dark blue suit, his posture still as straight as the day he left the service. The metal on his chest glinted softly under the graduation hall lights, but it was clear no one was looking at the medals. They were looking at his skin. His son was about to walk across the stage, a moment they had waited for their whole lives, but instead of applause, he was met with suspicion. And then security moved in. They said he didn't belong. But before he could even speak, something unexpected happened. Across the room, a group of men stood up, quietly, calmly. No shouting, no pushing, just presence. They were Navy SEALs, decorated, respected, and very much watching. And in that moment, the tone of the room shifted. Today, we're not just telling a story about one man. We're uncovering a truth that echoes through generations. A story about dignity, about silent power, and about what happens when the right people stand up even without saying a word. If you've ever wondered what real strength looks like, not the kind that throws punches, but the kind that holds ground, then stay with us. Because this story will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Let's begin. Before he was stopped at the door, before the whispers and the stares, before the SEALs even stood up, he was simply a father. His name was Samuel Carter, but most people who served with him called him Sarge. He didn't grow up with much. Born in rural Georgia during the tail end of the civil rights movement, Samuel learned early what it meant to walk with dignity even when the world tried to look away. He joined the Marines at 19, not because he loved war, but because he believed in service. Over the years, he served in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He earned 3 medals for bravery, but if you asked him about them, he'd shrug and talk about the men he lost, the brothers who didn't make it home. That was the kind of man. He was humble, grounded, and loyal to the end. After retiring, he didn't chase recognition. He worked part-time at a hardware store, coached his nephew's baseball team, and quietly helped other vets navigate their VA paperwork. Never once did he raise his voice to be heard. But his greatest pride wasn't in his medals or his rank. It was in his son Marcus, the first in their family to graduate college. That graduation day was supposed to be a celebration of everything they'd overcome together. Samuel had worn his best suit and his Marine Corps lapel pin, not to be noticed, but to show his son, "I'm proud of you, son, and I'm here." So when security questioned whether he belonged, it wasn't just an insult to him, it was a denial of everything he had quietly stood for his entire life. And that's the heart of the story, isn't it? How can a man who gave his youth to defend this country be treated like a stranger in it? Sometimes we forget that beneath the uniform is a human story, one filled with sacrifice, loyalty, and a quiet kind of courage, the kind that doesn't need to shout. And as we move into what happened next, you'll see courage doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looks like standing still and waiting to be seen. The sun was soft that morning. You know, the kind of day it feels like the world has paused to let something beautiful happen. Inside the auditorium, rows of proud families held bouquets, phones ready, hearts full. It was graduation day at Westbridge University, and for Marcus Carter, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a generational one. The first in his family to wear a cap and gown. A dream that once felt out of reach had finally come true. Samuel arrived early. He found his seat in the reserved section row, 4 seat B, right where the invitation had directed him. He adjusted his tie, smoothed the crease in his pants, and smiled quietly as the crowd swelled around him. But then, something changed. A security guard approached. "Sir, this section is for family members only." "I am family," Samuel said calmly. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out the formal, university-issued guest badge, the same one mailed to him weeks ago. Still, the guard didn't budge. Another joined him, and then came the questions. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Can we see some ID? Do you belong to one of the graduates?" Samuel didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply held up the badge again. His voice was measured, firm. "Yes, Marcus Carter. That's my son." People nearby began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, some watched unsure. The tension was quiet, but it filled the air like thick smoke. Meanwhile, on stage, Marcus was moments from walking out. What was supposed to be a milestone for the Carter family was now becoming a scene. A celebration turned sour, not because of violence, not because of chaos, but because someone looked at a proud black father in a suit and didn't see belonging. They saw a question mark. And this is the part that stings not just for Samuel, but for so many who felt that same pause, that same doubt in rooms where joy should have been the only emotion. How many black fathers have had to prove they deserve to stand next to their children on their proudest day? And why does it still happen even in 2025? It's a moment that echoes louder than any speech that day. Because it wasn't just about a seat or a badge or a misunderstanding. It was about dignity, about how easily it can be dismissed and how powerful it is when someone refuses to let that happen. And just when it seemed like the moment would unravel, something quietly extraordinary took place. Let me tell you what happened next. What happened to Samuel that morning wasn't loud. There were no slurs, no yelling, no shoving, just a series of questions delivered with a polite smile and a professional tone. Are you sure this is your seat? Can I see another form of ID? This section is for family. On the surface, it all seemed harmless, reasonable even. But if you've lived it, if you've felt it, you know the difference. This is what we call a microaggression. It's not overt hate, it's the quiet erosion of belonging. The subtle glance that says you don't fit here. The random ID checks. The surprise when you speak so well. The assumption that someone like you couldn't possibly be a doctor or a professor or the father of a graduating student. They're invisible weapons. And they cut deep because they come dressed in civility. It's not just about Samuel. This happens every day. Like when Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, the first black Surgeon General of California, was mistaken for a staff assistant in her own office. Or when Air Force veteran Rosalind Johnson was asked to step out of the TSA line for a special check, despite traveling weekly in uniform for over a decade. Each time the message is the same: prove yourself again. And that's what makes it so exhausting. It's not one blow, it's 1,000 paper cuts. Have you ever walked into a room and felt without anyone saying it out loud that you needed to explain why you were there? That's the emotional toll of microaggressions. Not because others shouted you down, but because they quietly questioned your right to exist in that space. But here's the thing about invisible weapons: they don't work when we see them for what they are, when we name them, when we don't brush them off as just a misunderstanding. Because once you name the wound, you can start to heal it. You can protect others from feeling it too. And in Samuel's case, that healing didn't begin with a protest. It didn't begin with a fight. It began when someone else in the room finally chose to stand. Just when it seemed the moment would collapse in silence, a shift happened, not in words but in presence. 3 rows behind Samuel, a man stood up, tall, composed. His blazer hugged his shoulders just tight enough to reveal the outline of military posture that never quite fades. Then another stood, and another. No one said a word. They didn't raise signs. They didn't yell. They didn't need to, because sometimes silence, when delivered by the right people, is louder than protest. They were Navy SEALs. Retired, yes, but you could tell by how they moved, how they stood. Men who had served with Samuel. Not all of them were black. Some were white. One was Latino. But in that moment, they weren't a list of skin tones. They were a wall, a quiet, unmovable wall of respect. They stepped forward, forming a half circle behind him, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to be seen, just enough to say he's not alone. The guards hesitated. The air changed. The crowd noticed. And Samuel, he didn't say a thing. He just looked forward, hands folded in front of him, as if he already knew they'd be there. You see, real brotherhood doesn't vanish after the battlefield. It doesn't stop when the mission ends. And it sure doesn't care what color your skin is. In the military, you don't fight for a flag alone. You fight for the man beside you, the one who carried your pack when your leg gave out, the one who shielded you during gunfire, the one who told your mother you made it home. That bond isn't written on a certificate. It's earned in silence, in sacrifice, in blood. So here's the question that lingers long after the ceremony ended. Why is it that some men have to rely on uniforms to be seen as worthy, while others are simply assumed to belong? What those SEALs did wasn't dramatic, but it was revolutionary in its own quiet way. They reminded the world respect isn't granted based on appearance, it's given where it's due. And as we move forward in this story, you'll see that what they did that day, without a single word, was only the beginning. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance is the kind that doesn't ask permission. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels powerful, heavy, intentional. That was the kind of silence that filled the auditorium when the SEALs stood up. No fists were clenched, no voices were raised, and yet the tension in the room shifted almost like gravity had rearranged itself. The security guards who just moments earlier had questioned Samuel's right to be there suddenly found themselves standing in front of something bigger, not in size but in weight. The weight of solidarity, of history, of unspoken authority that says this man matters. What made that moment so striking wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. Samuel never lashed out. He never demanded justice. He stood in stillness. And beside him, so did those who knew his worth. In a world where anger is often the expected response, there's something deeply unsettling and deeply moving about choosing restraint, choosing silence. Think about Rosa Parks. She didn't scream. She didn't push back. She just didn't move. Or the Vietnam War veterans who stood in quiet protest by turning their medals in on the steps of the Capitol. Their silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It was dignity wrapped in discipline. Because sometimes silence isn't the absence of action, it is the action. It forces people to confront their discomfort. It removes the noise and leaves only truth. Have you ever been so hurt, so disrespected, that your silence spoke louder than anything you could have said? And did anyone notice? In Samuel's case, people noticed. The crowd didn't erupt, but they leaned in. They watched. Some began to stand too quietly one by one without instruction. And in that moment, something beautiful happened. The noise of judgment was replaced by the silence of respect. But as powerful as that moment was, it didn't come from nowhere. It was built on a legacy, one that stretches far beyond that graduation hall. To truly understand the weight of what happened, we need to look back to the very foundation of service sacrifice and the long, often forgotten history of Black veterans in America. The truth is, Samuel Carter didn't stand alone that day just because of who he was. He stood on the shoulders of those who came before him. Men whose names we rarely hear in history class. Men who wore the same uniform, swore the same oath, bled on the same battlefields, but came home to a country that refused to see them. Think about the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black regiments formed after the Civil War. They fought bravely in the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, even World War I. And yet when they returned home, they were denied basic rights, refused service in restaurants, turned away from voting booths, called out of their names in the very towns they defended. Or the Tuskegee Airmen, black fighter pilots who flew over 15,000 missions in World War II. They protected bombers with unmatched precision. But back on American soil, they weren't allowed to eat in the same diners as the white pilots they saved. And what about Sergeant Isaac Woodard, blinded by police just hours after being honorably discharged in 1946, still in uniform, simply for asking if he could use a restroom? He never saw his country again, literally, and no one was held accountable. So here's the uncomfortable question. Why do we honor Black soldiers when they're in uniform, but question them the moment they're not? Why does the badge or the medal or the military ID have to serve as a constant permission slip for dignity? Samuel didn't bring his medals to impress anyone. He brought them to witness his son's future. But the truth is, to many people in that room, those medals still weren't enough. And that's the ache so many Black veterans carry, not from war, but from home, from the country they defended. That still sometimes needs reminding of who they are. Yet through that ache, they walk forward. They stand up. They show up. Because history may try to forget them, but they never forget who they are. And on that day when Samuel was asked to prove his place, he didn't reach for anger, he reached for legacy. But what if in that moment no one had stood up with him? What if the SEALs had stayed seated? What happens when good people stay silent? Let's take a look at that. It's easy to look at that moment, the SEALs standing in quiet solidarity, and feel moved. But let's pause for a second and ask the harder question, what if they hadn't? What if they had looked away? What if they had said, it's not my place or I don't want to get involved? Samuel might have been escorted out. Marcus might have seen his father humiliated in front of hundreds on the proudest day of his life. And the audience, perhaps many, would have just sat quietly, unsure, uncomfortable, saying nothing. Another small injustice swallowed by silence. That's the cost of inaction. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it slips by unnoticed, but its damage lingers. We've seen it before. In 1963, when civil rights activist Medgar Evers was murdered in his own driveway, there were neighbors who heard the gunshot and said nothing. In 2018, a black Yale student was napping in her dorm common room. A white student called the police. Officers arrived not to help, but to interrogate the one who was asleep. No one else in the building spoke up. And of course, we all remember the case of George Floyd, a man pleading for breath surrounded by onlookers. Many filmed, few intervened. The truth is, silence can feel safe. It can feel neutral. But in moments of injustice, silence is rarely neutral. It sides with the status quo. It protects power, not people. So here's the real question. When it's your turn to choose, will you stay seated or will you stand? Because when the SEALs rose that day, they didn't just protect a fellow veteran. They protected his dignity. They disrupted the pattern. They reminded everyone in that room, you are not invisible. You are not alone. And that's the heart of it. Change doesn't always start with a microphone. Sometimes it begins with someone rising from their seat and saying nothing at all. But even after that moment passed, after Samuel stayed in his seat and Marcus crossed the stage, the story didn't end there. Because that day wasn't just a personal victory, it became a turning point. For a father, for a son, and maybe for all of us. Let me show you why. As the final names were called and the graduates tossed their caps into the air, a wave of applause filled the auditorium. Marcus Carter stood among them, smiling proud eyes, glistening with a quiet joy. But down below in the fourth row, something even more powerful had just taken place. His father was still seated, upright, calm, unmoved not by arrogance but by purpose. He hadn't been removed. He hadn't shouted. He had simply stayed. And because of that, the world around him had shifted. That day, the lesson wasn't just about academic achievement. It was about dignity. You see, dignity isn't a pass you're given. It isn't earned only through titles or validated by uniforms or confirmed by someone else's approval. Dignity is inherent. It walks in with you, not because of where you come from, but because of who you are. And too often, especially for black men like Samuel, society treats dignity like something conditional, as if it can be granted or revoked based on mood, misunderstanding, or melanin. But that graduation told a different story. That day, it wasn't a principle or a policy that restored Samuel's place. It was presence. It was people who saw what others chose not to. And it raises the question, how many moments of quiet injustice go unseen, simply because no one around chooses to see them? The applause that filled the room wasn't just for Marcus. It was for every father who stayed, for every veteran who's been overlooked, for every person who's had to prove they belong in a place they helped build. And that's the gift of that moment. It reminds us that the fight for dignity doesn't always happen in courtrooms or protests. Sometimes it happens in the stillness of one man, refusing to be erased. But as moving as that day was, it wasn't the end of the story. Because the truth is, what happened inside that auditorium began to ripple far beyond it. Into conversations, into communities, into change. And that brings us to something even bigger. Because this story at its core was never just about one man. It was about all of us. It's tempting to look at Samuel Carter's story and see it as a one-time event, a misunderstanding, a moment that passed. But the truth is, this story didn't end when the crowd applauded or when the ceremony was over. It continued in the minds and hearts of everyone who saw it, and maybe in those of us hearing it now. Because this wasn't just about one man being questioned. It was about what happens when society quietly teaches us who deserves to be here and who still has to prove it. It was about how easy it is to let dignity become situational, how quickly respect can be withheld based on assumptions that go unspoken but never unfelt. And it was about the quiet courage it takes not just to endure injustice, but to respond with grace, with stillness, with unwavering presence. This story lives in every father who's been followed in a department store, every young black student whose confidence was mistaken for arrogance, every woman who's had to make herself smaller to be taken seriously, every immigrant who changes their name just to get a job interview. It's in all of us, because we've either lived it, or witnessed it, or ignored it. So here's the question none of us can afford to avoid anymore. When you see someone being quietly erased, will you be part of the silence or the stand? Samuel didn't ask to become a symbol, but in that moment he represented thousands. And the seals who stood behind him reminded the rest of us that we don't have to be famous or powerful or loud to make a difference. We just have to be present and brave enough to rise when it matters. Because sometimes the shift doesn't begin with a movement, it begins with a moment. One act of quiet resistance, one seat refused to be given up, one crowd that finally paid attention. And if we let that moment speak to us, not just today, but tomorrow, and the day after, then maybe we're one step closer to something better. But before we close, there's one final piece to this story. Because what happened that day left more than a memory, it left a call, a reminder of what we must carry forward and what we must never forget. Long after the chairs were folded and the lights dimmed, what happened at that graduation stayed with people. Not because it was loud, not because it made headlines, but because it revealed something true about who we are and who we still need to become. We must remember that dignity is not a gift from others. It's a light we carry, but sometimes the world tries to dim it slowly, quietly through questions, doubts, and silence. That's why we need each other, to help keep the light visible, to stand when someone else is being asked to shrink, to say with our presence, you matter. I see you. It doesn't always take a grand gesture. Sometimes it's standing up in a crowded room. Other times it's speaking up when the easy choice is to stay quiet, or teaching our children not just to be kind, but to be aware. A father tried to witness his son's moment. He came in peace. He was met with doubt, but he left that room with something more powerful than approval. He left with people who chose to stand beside him because it was right, and now that choice is ours. The question is no longer, what would you have done in that room? It's what will you do in the next one? The next time you see someone being questioned for simply being there, will you speak? Will you rise? Will you remember Samuel Carter? Because these stories don't just belong to the people in them. They belong to us all. To remind us that justice doesn't always wear a badge, that change doesn't always begin in courtrooms. It begins with presence, with courage, with a quiet voice inside saying, this matters. And if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like it, share it, talk about it, because someone out there is still sitting in that fourth row seat quietly hoping they're not alone. Let's be the ones who choose to stand. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.